this was I think the original piece that was almost like the first piece that came, the first piece of the exhibition, really, the oldest. This is actually like a bronze cast of the palette I used to make that painting. So it's like a reproduction of the palette which was used to create that picture. It's sort of like this idea of I suppose it's like this idea of reality, or of the idea of kind of who's the author, or at what point is the origin, where does something come from, the origin of things, or the origin of thinking. At what point does an object start and stop? At what point does an object become an object? And in a way, like this idea of the egg is this idea of something which is fully alien but fully kind of incorporate. I think everybody is a sort of I want to say a universal symbol, but then I think the universe is possibly something that we can't even begin to think about how it might be symbolized, so we couldn't really have a universal symbol. But having said that, I said to someone recently that if you were to just travel out on a laser beam and just go straight, in the end you'd probably end up where you started. And what you would have done is you would have described an egg, with something like this, which is taken from De Chirico. So it's a kind of, again, like a kind of pre-cubistic idea of the model, like the mannequin, the egg as a kind of metaphysical form. And again, like this was 2003 now, so this is actually earlier, but it just seemed to fit in with the mould. But again, like you've got that put next door to this, where you've got this is called Ich mach mit, I make myself. And so what happens is that the painting, and as I'm making the painting, I start mixing the paints. In order to paint the thumb and the thing, I start using the palette which I'm painting a picture of. I start using that to paint as the palette. So this is a palette, and it's a painting of a palette at the same time. It sort of makes itself, and then this palette then comes over to here and starts referring to this palette here. Now this palette here was the palette I used to paint this egg with egg tempera paint, which is obviously like one of the first kind of forms of paint medium. So I used I had the yellow in here and the white in here. And so this was the palette I used in order to paint that, and that was the brush I used in order to paint this egg. And again, like this, so this is the sculpture of Wittgenstein, who quite famously, the logical positivist, he posits the idea that, if you can't talk about it, if you can't articulate it, there's no point in dealing with it. So he's not someone who's that bothered or interested in seeing into the future, into clairvoyancy, into the analysis of dreams. Although obviously at that point in terms of Vienna and successionism, Freud and Wittgenstein were kind of leading the charge in terms of sort of like the description of the mind, how to engage and describe the mind, which then comes out in paintings, maybe by surrealists, which talk about the way that the mind makes its own paintings, makes its own sense, it develops its own logic, it develops its own theories. And maybe in dreams you're closer to a more straightforward and more kind of honest relationship to thoughts than you are in the daytime. What he's actually doing is he's reenacting a painting by, I've got his little thing here. So he's basically staging a reenaction of a painting by Magritte, which is called The Clairvoyant. Obviously in this painting, Magritte, when he sees the egg, he paints the bird, but Wittgenstein, being Wittgenstein, sees the egg and paints the egg. It's really about the idea of chasing down the object. It's about the suggestion of the object, or it's about missing the object or signifying the object. So you've got he, she and it, Obviously, in some languages, we don't have these same. We don't have this. That's not compartmentalized in the same way. But obviously, in English, you're able to have this thing which is it, which is basically an unneutered. It's ungendered object. So it's an inanimate object, and generally, like that would be the search for the object in terms of an art object. So the art object is a pictorialized version of its former self. So if we take something from the real world and we put it into the art gallery, it becomes a picture of its former self. If we take a telephone and we put it in an art gallery, even if it's a telephone you can use, you're still using the telephone and having the telephone as a pictorial representation of the telephone that it was before when it was in the real world. Its position and its use function starts to operate in a slightly different way. And I was just interested in this idea of it and trying to get to it. So this is it. This is not it. Again, a kind of version of colour field it paintings, tons de fonds. This is called objective subjective object. So that basically what we've got is a painted depiction of the word it, and also a painted depiction of the word it sitting next door to it. But again, it's a parody of Magritte's painting, where he has a painting of a pipe here and a painting of a pipe here, as if to suggest that within the painting we can have different kinds of pictorial order, that we can have different kinds of reality. And obviously a word in itself has a very kind of curious reality unto itself, as a pictorial signifier of itself, and also a meaningful description of something outside of itself. So there's an Italian arte povera artist called Alighiero Boetti, and a very late sculpture by him. He's a sculpture of him standing with a hose on his head, on a hot head. So this is a kind of homage work to him. And it relates to a series of other sort of figurative sculptures that I've made over the years, where I've been in the past I've been holding a gun or I've been pointing or something, and now I'm kind of holding a hose onto myself. First of all, I made this one, and basically I've been making a series of canvases where I was actually just stabbing the surface of them, and the first coat I would do is just a coloured field, and suddenly I came in the morning and I had these two made, and I thought, oh, I actually really like just these colours in relationship to one another. So now we've just got shape and colour, and I started thinking about symbols and about colour associations that had relationships to some sort of like a flag or like a football team or some element of, or even like a bit of corporate design, packaging, branding, just this idea of kind of limiting and almost like buying into specific colours. And I suddenly thought that the way that these works could start to kind of make some extra sense as well, as I suddenly thought of Ellsworth Kelly's very minimal paintings, and I thought, well, maybe under the terms that Ellsworth Kelly's paintings work, maybe I could make these work, and I could just suggest these as a kind of solution to the problem of painting or not painting, or the moment the painting starts to become a sculpture. There's a sort of English joke with a door in this particular point, in this particular way, because when the door is halfway open, it's like not quite open, and definitely not closed. It's 45 degrees, so it's half open and half closed. You can go through it, but not really. It's not quite open. And in English, you call it, the word is ajar, So there's an actual word to describe this sense of not quite open, halfway between open and closed. It's called ajar. Now, obviously, it's actually spelled A-J-A-R, one word. But if we split it and we say a jar in English is the thing that you keep jam and honey and stuff like that in, a glass jar, or like a bell jar, which is something the shape like a bell, a jar. And there's a joke which says, when is a door not a door? When it's a jar. So obviously we've got this idea of something not being something, and again it brings us back to Magritte, and also it references a painting by Magritte called La Victoire, where you have a door and a door frame with a cloud floating through the door. The door and a door frame, in a strange way, is actually very, very similar to an egg. If we think about an egg in terms of architecture, an egg is kind of like all one big door or one big wall. Certainly for the chick inside or the little baby bird inside, at some point, it's going to have to break through that. And so there's a strange and interesting and beautiful overlap between the door and a door frame and like a door and an egg. They're both doors, and maybe this is an egg. So I've made it about over 600 pieces with eggs in, through my career, and during the early 2000s, like 2004, 2005, I made a series of eggs that were this size, but they were made in acrylic. They were made in like a fiberglass, and then they were painted. So they were quite realistic looking, but they were actually quite delicate. And I also was unhappy actually with the idea of using these esters, the acrylics, like the polyurethane. It's not such a great thing to use, and I now have basically just thrown it all at this piece, at the project now, and I've made them now in bronze, which is a kind of another level. And I've kind of also I've accepted the fact that this now it has all those sculptural properties. Quite often I make a bronze and then I paint it so it looks like something else. It doesn't look like what it does. Whereas this one looks like a big bronze egg. It is what it says it is, in a sort of strange way. This is actually just a perfect reproduction of the bin, the dustbin in my studio. And it literally had got to the point where it started looking like some sort of crazy bit of abstract expressionism. It looks a bit like a palette. It looks a bit like something that, in fact, it is really like a palette in a way. It's a sort of sculptural palette. It's a sort of part of a process, or part of a way that we would process things through a making process. So it's like what I liked was that it bared testament to all the things, all the creative things that have come out of the studio. That in some ways it in itself is the kind of antimatter. So if we make art and we make matter, other stuff gets made in the process. No one consciously really thought about what they were doing when they made any of these marks. The marks all happened without really any kind of, not by design, by accident. So the work is kind of made by accident. But then what we do is when we cast it in bronze and paint it, we have to actually look really hard, and we have to fabricate each one of these accidents and remake each accident, but really kind of carefully and sort of meticulously relive through the accidents. I think also the idea of not being able to see things, and inside and outside, and people coming from the street and coming into a gallery and feeling like they don't really they can't engage, they don't understand something. They fit, the general way of dealing with it is to go, it's just all rubbish. It's just all rubbish, and just to basically blank kind of refuse to engage with it. And I think that this was sort of like, by putting this just by the door as you enter the gallery, it's like put all your preconceptions, you know, when you come in, just put your preconceptions about what you want to think and how you think and what you've already thought about and what you're prepared to think about. Just take all of those preconceptions, just park them in here for the moment, and then go and see the show. And then and then you can pick them up again if you want as you leave, but hopefully you won't need them anymore.